The war was on, and the reports informed about the conquered Russian cities. The Stalingrad catastrophe didn't happen yet, and Wehrmacht divisions were going to the east. The Germans still believed in their Führer and were waiting for victory. But the most shrewd German leaders knew for certain that the Third Reich was doomed. The calculation of forces of the countries at war didn't leave any doubt in the result of the war. In 1942, a huge-scale secret operation started, the preparation of the German defeat. It was top-secret work. Neither Russians nor Americans should know about it. The Führer shouldn't know about it either. If historical events have logic, the leaders of that work should have disappeared and hidden themselves in the prepared shelters. Those officials who really disappeared at the decisive moment were secret organizers of the Fourth Reich. History prompts us the names of the people who in 1945 managed to avoid a bullet. Now, the Führer's bunker is a historical monument. The witness of dramatic events of May 1945, when after the strikes of the Allies, the Nazi Empire was reduced to 1 square kilometer. To this point on the map, to the final point in the history of the Third Reich. Now, guides tell curious Germans and foreigners about the last sigh of the fascist monster, about the superhumans who were hiding from the revenge, about 60-year-old events. Bormann was in the bunker together with Hitler. He wanted the Führer to appoint him official minister of the party affairs. Bormann was in the bunker together with Hitler. He wanted the Führer to appoint him officially minister of the party affairs. Other posts didn't interest him. He got rid of everybody who could be in the way. New treachery. He telegraphed to Hitler's successor, Deniz. Himmler suggested to surrender. It was necessary to take tough measures. Now everything's over. Hitler is dead. Goebbels killed himself. Göring is a traitor. Himmler was guilty in the links with the enemy. There were neither friends nor enemies, and Bormann had the Führer's testament, and the power over the Fourth Reich was now in his hands. Officially, from the night of the 1st to the 2nd of May, with a group of SS men, he decided to penetrate through the dislocation of the Soviet troops. Several hours later, Bormann disappeared. On the 2nd of May, specially created teams, Schmersch, started to search the bunker and the adjacent territory. Step after step, meter after meter, Bormann was neither alive nor dead. The archives with secret documents and the party's gold reserves disappeared together with Bormann. In Germany, the posters were spread reporting about the searches of Martin Bormann. For the information about the Reichsleiter, the Americans promised a fantastic reward, $1,000. The radio of Hamburg reported about his features. Born in 1900, joined NSDAP in February 1927. Party membership card number 60508. Reichsleiter Gruppenführer SS. Not tall, a bit chubby. The hair's thin. He really looked like a provincial accountant. He was wearing a baggy uniform and holding a thick case under his arm, but it was enough to look attentively at his face to understand that this impression was deceitful. His head, a short, strong neck, and he looked like a bulldog with strong jaws, tightly clenched lips, and a tough expression of dark eyes. This person was extremely dangerous. Everyone was scared of him. The victims of his intrigues were from Hitler's bodyguards and generals to such political heavyweights as Himmler, Goebbels, and Göring. They said that Hitler himself was scared of him. He was hated by all generals and top leaders of the Reich. Arch-scoundrel, evil spirit, Lucifer, archangel of evil, brown Bolshevik, is not the whole list of nicknames given to him by his closest party associates. Goebbels, who was considered to be a genius, could not defeat Bormann. This uncouth, stupid, and dishonest plotter in the struggle for the favor of the Führer.
He was mysterious for everybody. They understood that he had a strong influence. Similar information was reported by the intelligence. The party machine knew who was Bormann. They received this information. That was the reason of interest. Who is Mr. Bormann?
Who is Mr. Bormann?
The Soviet intelligence kept silent in its searches of Nazi number 2. It captured those who'd spent the last days in the bunker, those who together with Bormann had tried to escape. Hitler's personal driver Erich Kempka, Hitler's personal pilot Bauer, the Führer of German youth Artur Axmann, Hitler's assistant Gunsche, and others. Cross-interrogations of witnesses made it worse.
About 15 witnesses, including Hitler's private pilot and a driver, affirmed for sure that he'd been shot in one of the streets in Berlin on the 1st of May, 1945. Dressed in the uniform of SS Major General, he was trying to get on the tank, which was supposed to take him away from Berlin. At that moment, he was shot by the Soviet soldier. There's no proofs of any version. According to some information, Bormann survived in that Berlin mincing machine.
Cross-interrogation of top officials and intelligence data said the following. Top secret to Marshal of the USSR, I.V. Stalin. I report about the message of the head of the intelligence of the First Belarusian Front about the destiny of Hitler and other state and political officials of Germany, made up after the testimony of the captive German generals. According to the prisoner's testimony, Bormann escaped in order to hand the Führer's testament to Denise. Head of the Chief Intelligence Agency, General Kuznetsov. On May 10, Marshal Zhukov made an official statement. We don't know about the whereabouts of Führer's personal assistant, Bormann. The disappearance of Bormann worried Stalin and spoilt all his joy of the victory. At first sight, it doesn't matter if Germany is defeated and the red flag is fluttering over the Reichstag. Stalin realized that Bormann's disappearance is not occasional and will have dangerous consequences. Stalin knew about the attempts of Hitler's leaders to make a separate agreement with allies. The Führer hoped that Germany would be the arena of a new war. But now, between Russia and America, millions of German soldiers were still armed. Dozens of Wehrmacht divisions presented a force ready to carry out new orders. Will Bormann be the man who will give those orders? Will the Allies deal with him? Natalia Lebedeva, Doctor of History.
We were scared that he'd be used in separate deals. We suspected the Allies that behind the USSR, they would make a separate peace.
Stalin didn't trust the Allies. He realized the defeat of Germany made possible this strange union between Bolshevik Russia and capitalist America. The time of the new confrontation came. The Allies didn't trust Stalin either. Bormann's disappearance was also dangerous for them. They had their reasons to believe that Bormann had been captured by Russians. They suspected Bormann would become a key figure in the unification of Germany under the USSR flag. The calculations of American and British analysts showed that the Soviet army would need a week to reach La Manche, and with the help of defeated but strong Germany, will dictate their will to Europe. With his disappearance, Bormann became a trump in the dangerous game which had been started by the Allies.
The Western Allies didn't start to disarm actively, German even after the capitulation. They lingered in disarming German armed forces. Armed units were simply standing in the camps and could be used at any moment. In that case, Bormann, Karl Denitz, and other leaders could hope that they'd be accepted as partners, but not as criminals.
On July 17, 1945, the Soviet radio officially informed that Bormann was alive and had been with the Allies. The British headquarters, Montgomery, answered, "We don't have him." "We don't have him either," said the Americans. Thousands of people started to look for the disappeared Nazi. He was looked for in all parts of Germany, and also in Italy, Austria, Spain, and Denmark. In Moscow, London, and Washington, they took from the intelligence archives folders with Martin Bormann's dossier. His biography, the events of his life, should give an answer where he was going and what his purposes were. He was called Führer's shadow. There was neither Führer nor the Reich, but the shadow stayed. Anyone who could know something about Bormann was immediately cross-interrogated. This person was one of the first who'd given evidence.
He was not a tyrant. He tried to be a good father. When the war started, he seldom came home. In his house, Nober-Salzburg, father kept in his study Kant's saying, his famous categorical imperative, live in such a way that your behavior could serve a moral law for everybody. Father's mistake was that he'd chosen Hitler as an example and moral ideal.
From the correspondence of Martin Bormann to Gerda Bormann, 4/04/1944. Silence is the most reasonable line of behavior. One should tell the truth only when it's really necessary. One should never be sure of the people surrounding you. Bormann started his way to power as the majority of the Nazis. He was climbing up stained with blood up to his knees. In 1924, Bormann was arrested for the murder of his friend Kadov and was sentenced to 1 year in prison. Later, this murder and a year of prison would be awarded by the Nazi Order of Blood, which Bormann would receive from Hitler. Having left the prison in 1925, Bormann joined the Nazi Party and was engaged in administrative work. He was irreplaceable in that quality. In 1933, after NSDAP had come to power, his career started to go up. Reichsleiter General, head of the office of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's assistant. Bormann's career rise was not suspicious for Nazi except one detail. A. Speer noticed that Bormann's methods of gaining power were the same as Stalin's when Lenin was alive. Next, Bormann married Gerda Buch.
My mother was 19 when she got married. She wasn't a confirmed Nazi from childhood, though her father was a party judge. And in 1933, he officially became a supreme judge of the Nazi Party. But in 1929, at the wedding, where Hitler was groom's witness, my father's witness, my mother was a fanatic Hitler's adherent.
Now he found himself among the Führer's trusted persons. Bormann preferred the power of Grey Cardinal. He skillfully manipulated people under their weaknesses. He found a young wife for the old financier, Schacht. He helped Grimler. Bormann's wife, Gerda, became the friend of his young mistress. He helped Grimler with money by giving him a big sum from the party cash box. He subjected to his influence Hess by assuming functions of the Führer's assistant partners for non-traditional sexual pleasures.
Later, many medical conclusions appeared, saying that Hitler was a latent homosexual. as many other officials of the Third Reich. The fact that Bormann was with him and, as we say now, positioned himself as macho and male. Bormann embodied a man for Hitler, who himself possessed all the qualities of a mentally unbalanced person. It was also concerned his orientation. He had problems both with men and women and with people.
Bormann did his best to become necessary for the Führer. He built Berghof, Hitler's House of Berchtesgaden, and then managed it. The house was registered on Bormann's name. He assumed the decision of all financial issues. He bought paintings for the Führer's collection. He became the ideal Hitler's footman. He became the chief's main assistant because he was his assistant in personal life. Nazi leaders were ready for everything to get to power. But neither Göring nor Goebbels, Himmler, and Ribbentrop could personally serve the chief. Bormann could. He commanded Hitler's doctors, drivers, and valets. In reality, he was a caring spouse, but not Eva Braun. He knew how at nights the Führer woke up shouting. He saw a person with flabby muscles and such a hollow chest that he had to put pads under his suit. Very few people could speak to Hitler in Bormann's absence.
Everyone went to ask him for favors. All the Reich leaders. Not a single decision was possible without Bormann's oral or written sanction. It was really so.
He was a devoted dog who followed Hitler, guessed his wishes, interpreted his dreams, smoothed over his weak days and softly directed lunch conversations, which sooner or later led some guests to the grave, or to the sudden promotion. He made up daily schedules for Hitler. He decided whom the chief would receive. He was in charge of everything, from guarding Hitler up to making up a menu. He quickly translated into the language of orders the Führer's words and directives. Hermann Grammel, professor of the Institute of Modern History, Munich, the expert on the history of the Third Reich, says that compared to his predecessor Hess, Bormann was obsessed by the thirst for power. When Bormann came, everything changed. Everything depended personally on him. Bormann controlled Hitler. From Bormann's correspondence, Martin Bormann to Goethe, 12/12/1943. It's not good that wins a victory, but a strong one defeats a weak one. That's why we should raise in our people firmness and harden their characters. The elite of the Third Reich didn't like Bormann. He was called a bumpkin, a swine in the potato field. The killing characteristics of Bormann was given by his sworn enemy, Hermann Göring. Small secretary, big plotter, and dirty swine. Bormann spat on the people's opinion. Hitler liked and trusted him. If Hitler criticized Bormann, noticed Speer, the enemies would cut his throat. But Hitler was never tired of Bormann and didn't say those critical words.
I asked, "What is National Socialism?" And my father answered, "National Socialism is Hitler's will." For him, Hitler will, with the highest notion of measure in the nationalist socialist structure of the world. Later, I realized to what degree my father was in Hitler's power.
The first months of Bormann's searches didn't give any results. But at the end of July 1945, the German writer Ginrich Glinau said that he'd met Bormann in the train going from Hamburg to Flensburg. It was very hard to blame an anti-fascist writer in trying to make a cheap sensation. His testimony convinced the judges of the Nuremberg trial that Bormann was alive and should be convicted. He was the only person who was convicted in his absence. From the verdict of the military tribunal. According to the verdict of guilty, pleading guilty, the accused, and on the basis of Article 27, the International Military Tribunal sentenced Martin Bormann to execution through hanging. On the question, "Where's Bormann now?" Göring angrily answered, "I hope he's burning in hell." This statement of one of the main Nazi criminals looks at least strange. Like many others, he didn't like Bormann. Nevertheless, the latter was his party associate. Why did Göring hate Bormann so much? The judges didn't share Göring's hope. They were sure that Bormann was nearby and was attentively watching the trial. So the tribunal announced the searches of Bormann. The price for the information about Bormann rose up to 100,000 marks. Messages from various corners started to come. Bormann was seen in Australia, Egypt, and Italy. Bormann was haunted to journalists, diplomats, and pilots. Bormann's phantom appeared in different places to different people at the same time, all that looked like global mystification cooked up by numerous false witnesses.
Bormann was looked for everywhere and was buried many times. He was absolutely in different countries, under absolutely different names: Manfredo Berg, Cortegall, Van Clauten, Jose Acero, Luigi Bonlilio, Elazar Goldstein, Josef Jane, Martino Pornagione. Those are his so-called names. He was seen in Italy, even in a concrete place, in St. Antonio Templar's Monastery, Argentina, Chile, a Roman Catholic priest in Poland. He was seen in Spain and Paraguay. The years of his death: Italy 1952, Paraguay 1959, USSR 1973, Argentina 1975, Great Britain 1989.
The experts in American intelligence used the technology based on the methods of studying the enemy at a distance. This technology was worked out by the expert on ancient history, the Oxford professor Ronald Syme. He managed to revive the Roman emperor by means of studying those who'd surrounded him. The experts' conclusions stunned the US and British leaders. The experts insisted that for many years, Bormann passed himself off as the other man and was leading a double life. During the war, the U.S. Strategical Service managed to intercept radio telegrams, which Moscow exchanged with its agents in Switzerland and in Germany. Their deciphering took years, but the results justified all the efforts. Moscow was receiving operative, secret, and important information from the very heart of fascist Germany. The agent under the pseudonym Werther could answer any question about dislocation of Wehrmacht divisions, described in detail their available personnel and armament, disclosed strategical and operative plans. The American experts were especially shocked by the detailed descriptions of meetings in the Führer's narrow circle. Thus, on the 12th of September 1942, Paulus came to the headquarters of Vinica to see the plan of attacking Stalingrad. A day later, a shorthand report of the meeting was in Moscow. The Americans appreciated the significance of this data for the counterattack in Stalingrad. The Soviet command knew for certain that Germans wouldn't pass by the city from south and north. Hitler demanded to conquer Stalingrad by all means. The Soviet command concentrated big forces there, weakening other sections of the front. General Kleist, who was to head the offensive in Caucasus, said that Stalingrad was only a dot on the map, not far from my tank army. But why did that dot grow in size and turn into a big, fat cross for the German army?
What did Bormann really do? According to some information, during the Stalingrad battle, he passed through the scouts to the Soviet command. Very important information on the details of Germany's dislocation and number of fire units. And according to the opinion of such non-traditional historians, it accelerated the victory of the USSR, thanks to some very detailed information from the very top officials of the Reich.
The Wehrmacht's generals didn't understand why should they spare time on the assault of that city if the Volga River, this main artery of fuel supply, could be cut off at any other place. Friedrich von Paulus was sure that Stalin had used some links in Berlin to convince Hitler to throw his best forces on Stalingrad. General Guderian noticed that the Führer was leading an intuition war. But how were Hitler's intuitive decisions born? Who prompted them to the German chief? On July 3, 1942, Hitler told German Halder, "The enemy has known our plans since the moment of their confirmation." The crash of the Secret Service, Red Capella, had to confront the Führer. But even after the execution of Bolzin, Werther continued to furnish Stalin with information.
6 months later, after Stalingrad, the ensuing Kirkzaya battle was also accompanied with very detailed messages concerning the plans of the fascist army. Where did they come from? No one knows even now.
The American intelligence is convinced that it could be a person only from the closest circles of Hitler's associates. He was in the course of all the affairs, in the highest command of the Reich. He informed Moscow about the exact time of Hitler's appearance at the meeting, leaving it, and about the talks which had taken place in his absence. The agent informed Moscow not only about the Reich's secrets, but also interpreted them. Further to the center, the state of Manstein's group on September 15th can be regarded as defeated. For the period from August 15th, it lost half of its arms and 40% of personnel, which made up to 250,000 men. Himmler, Goebbels, Göring, Bormann, Keitel, Manstein, Guderian. Who could be Werther? The American Secret Service experts racked their brains over this puzzle. Some of the top-rank Nazis were excluded because they were not allowed to take decisions. Others couldn't know all information. When the work of Werther's identification was over, only one name remained in the list: Bormann.
Bormann is the embodiment of enigma in the history of the Second World War, which up to now gives us puzzles, and in which the last dot is not put.
Is Bormann a Soviet agent under the name of Werther? Everything was not so simple. Even few people in the CIA agreed with this version. Americans disposed of other, also very convincing facts and evidences. But they could be interpreted differently. It was only clear that Hitler discussed only with Bormann the possibility of Germany's defeat. He trusted only him to save the plundered goods. In 1946, in the report of the U.S. Treasury, Bormann was called the main organizer of displacement of the Reich's values to the safe places outside Germany. It was Bormann who, with the Führer's blessing, started to create the future Fourth Reich, right after Germany's defeat in Stalingrad. In 1943, he convened several times the secret meetings of industrialists who had helped Hitler to come to power. He suggested to hide gold and jewelry in the Alps. They transferred to South America gold worth $500 million. No one knows how much was buried in the Alps. Yelena Sionova, writer.
Different gigantic figures are named. This figure clearly shows the degree of plundering in Europe. In addition to gold and platinum, there were also works of art. They should be there up to now. At least Americans speak straightly about it. Several times, the journalists wrote that it was high time to organize rescue works in the Alps and try to find the values.
и все-таки попробовать найти это.
Bormann took very seriously this Hitler's task. It put him into the unique position. If for all Nazis the defeat meant death, for him it meant the very beginning. Let it be the underground Fourth Reich, but he, Bormann, is the Führer in it. And he's got a lot of money. The German army was struggling while he was creating organizations which would help Nazi to unite after the defeat. He thought out the ways of escape for top Nazi leaders and their family members. Bormann decided who would be saved and who would not. He distributed tickets to life after the crash. From Bormann's correspondence. Bormann to Gerda Bormann, 21/2/1944. What do the Nazis want? We want to adapt our people to the laws of nature, to teach them to fight for their existence. Any person, animal, or plant should fight for its existence. It also refers to the whole nation.
The successors of this SS Brotherhood, those so-called Deutsche Gamache, which also had a subsidiary, the Spider. It's a spider because all that web, all those spider legs, were scattered all over the world. All subsidiaries of big banks in Switzerland and in Central America had huge accounts belonging to fascist leaders.
In 1961, Bormann's stay in South America became an undisputed fact. A person who was responsible for the Jews issue, Adolf Eichmann, was seized by the Israeli agents and was put to trial in Jerusalem. At the trial, the former ambassador of Argentina in Israel said that Bormann escaped to Argentina. 5 years later, Eichmann's son, Klaus, wrote an open letter calling Bormann to quit the underground and to be convicted for the crimes he'd committed and for which Klaus's father had been sentenced instead of Bormann.
Do you know why the versions about Bormann's remaining alive are so firm? Why did they need Bormann so much? He was really looked for. Someone pretended to make a sensation. Others in particular, Americans, were looking for him. They really looked for him. What for? They had a material interest. They wanted to get information about the remaining 10 mines. Otherwise, what did they need him for?
The Nazis of the Third Reich who had remained alive were getting more sincere. In 1953, British Secret Services arrested Werner Neumann, State Secretary of Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. He said that he'd left the bunker with Bormann and added Bormann was saved by Russians. He was a Soviet spy and was going to meet with shock troops of the Red Army. Now, Bormann lives in Moscow. The German historian Wilhelm von Schramm affirmed that Adwehr was intercepting Bormann's messages sent to Moscow. Field Marshal von Paulus was sure that it was Bormann who'd been informing Moscow. During all the war, Albert Speer, who during the war headed the German industry, stated at the Nuremberg trial that Bormann's influence was a national calamity. Others used a more decisive language. Bormann was a real mole, a double agent of the highest level. Gottlieb Berger, SS general and head of Himmler's staff, had no doubts that Bormann had been Stalin's agent. Digging in Bormann's military past, the American experts found curious details. In 1942, he introduced into Hitler's headquarters his own spies. Keppen and Heim, who were constantly with the Führer, were ordered to put down secretly Hitler's every word, all his talks and ideas on the concrete military themes. Soon, Bormann went further. He convinced Hitler that stenographers must be present at all meetings. Thus, Bormann confirmed that after the Führer's death, the historians will get the exact list of his glorious deeds. Otherwise, the generals would appropriate this honor, which must belong only to the Führer. Bormann directed the deciphering of shorthand reports. The introduction of stenographers coincided with the requests to Werther of Soviet Secret Service to inform it about the preparation of the Germans for the Stalingrad battle.
All Hitler's stenographers were Bormann's employees, whom he personally instructed and whom he checked up. He was constantly reading their reports and rewrote them in his diaries. He took notes on cardboard plates, which were rather thick. The witnesses who were in the Reich office during the last days, he was constantly writing on such cardboard plates or on the thick paper. Then he put everything into big suitcases.
The most convincing proofs of Bormann's spying activity were presented by Gehlen, head of the West German Secret Service and head of the intelligence in the Eastern Front. One of the people saw on the newsreel a report about a football match in Moscow. Among the viewers, he recognized Bormann. The tape was checked up in Gehlen's agency and made a conclusion that it was Bormann. Soon, a scandal happened, as a result of which Gehlen's statement acquired a different meaning. In his agency, Soviet agents were found. They occupied high posts and had access to top-secret information. This story made the Americans remember the year 1945, when Gehlen surrendered to them and tried to attract their attention with his microtapes containing data about German secret services in the USSR and Eastern Europe. The former head of intelligence, Gehlen, did a correct move. He'd hidden drawers with priceless documents. But this operation was directed by Bormann. And if he were a Soviet spy, Russians possessed all the copies of Gehlen's papers. The crash of Gehlen's operation was shattering, but it helped the Americans to guess a puzzle. They found the unique decision reconciling two contradictory versions. Bormann created the underground Nazi empire under the control of the Soviet and in its interests. The Americans were sure that they managed to expose the plan, Stalin-Bormann, to direct the armed forces of the former enemy against today's enemy, against America. It was absurd only at first sight.
Baronessa von Haushofer.
Baroness von Haushofer, granddaughter of the scholar Karl Haushofer, said that her grandfather, who'd advanced a theory of winning living space for Germans, didn't think that it would be realized in life.
Не предполагал, кто и как ее применит на практике. Баронесса считает, что вина...
Baroness thinks that her grandfather had worked on Hitler and had developed a geopolitical theory in Nazi Germany.
Геополитическую теорию в нацистской Германии.
His trouble consisted in the fact that his ideas had very well fit in Hitler's plans on the conquest of the world.
По завоеванию мира.
The life showed that in the countries where the Nazis were, in the Arab world, in South America, and Southeast Asia, nationalistic moods were rapidly growing, and the national liberation movement started against the U.S. In the evening, Egyptians officers read Mein Kampf. In the day, learnt military science with USSR instructors. The former leader of Israeli intelligence, Mir Amid, says that after the fall of King Farouk, the Egyptians invited a group of Nazi officers and scholars to provide security for their country. If Bormann were really a Soviet agent, he would have been the greatest spy of all people and times. Could Bormann really be a Soviet spy? Silence of Soviet secret services is understandable. A secret service will never commit on the belonging of someone to its network. To say that Bormann was a Soviet spy means to admit that a military criminal and the ideologist of the German occupation policy in the East and one of the authors of the Holocaust was a communist who had worked with Stalin. But American Secret Services regarded such a version. Vitaly Korotkov, KGB colonel.
They let go this version walking around the world with a purpose to discredit the Soviet Union in a political sense. They say that the USSR, the Soviet reconnaissance or counter-reconnaissance, or someone else, maintained a contact with Bormann. After having recruited one of the Third Reich top officials and closest Hitler associate.
The Americans built up a logical version of the life and work of Martin Bormann. SS Reichsleiter, Gruppenführer, and Hitler's personal secretary as Stalin's agent in the Third Reich. It turned out that the Soviet leadership was to blame in fascists' crimes. Through Bormann, it made Hitler exterminate Jews, Poles, and Russians in order to force them to resistance. If this version were proved, the authority of the USSR, who'd suffered the greatest casualties and crushed the Third Reich, would be sullied by the complicity in this victory, one of the main Nazi criminals. The grandiose bluff would start to spread and would become a sensation, a propaganda bomb. In December 1972, the event happened which should have put an end to the story. The Berlin workers who were laying the cable discovered two skeletons in Ulap Station, in the place where Bormann's body had been seen in 1945. Forensic expertise identified one of the skeletons as the one belonging to Bormann. The reason of death? A suicide. Bormann took strong poison on May 2, 1945. Frankfurt's procurators' resolution on the criminal case against Bormann finally stopped searching for Martin Bormann. In 1998, on the request of Bormann's relatives, the DNA test was made which confirmed a 100% identity. At first sight, we could draw a line in the story.
The genetic expertise proved that those were Bormann's remains. But as we know from other stories connected with the analysis of the remains of the Tsar's family and other important facts, it doesn't prove anything. Everything can be falsified. Everything can be ordered. It's like the story with Hitler's skull, which at first sight is rather logical and fits in the conception. Nothing of the kind. Everything is problematic.
A new version appeared. Bormann died after May 1945 in the other place. Then his remains were secretly reburied in Berlin, where they were occasionally found. A tricky move could be made in order to cross out after-war Bormann's activities. And such a move seems to have taken place.
According to criminal law, the verdict of Nuremberg trial was absolutely just. But the final verdict is not people's, but God's verdict.
Bormann's after-war disappearance and his destiny are covered with mystery. Nazi N2 disappeared, and according to the well-known Nazi hunter, Simon Wiesenthal, caused more rumors, legends, and disputes than any other Nazi bigwig. In August 2000, his remnants were anonymously cremated, and his ashes were dispersed over the Baltic Sea.